The Winchester Mansion is famously one of the most haunted houses in the world. The true story of its construction is one that is rarely ever told. But today, I'm going to tell you the untold truth of Sarah Winchester, a story of tragic loss, remorse, and genocide. But first, we have to go back to 1862, when Sarah Pardee married a wealthy man named William Winchester. William and his father, Oliver Winchester, used the small fortune they had made manufacturing men's dress shirts to purchase a company called Smith & Wesson. By 1866, they developed the Winchester repeater rifle. These new firearms were used in the bloody conquest to colonize Western America. These rifles were used to massacre nearly 300 Lakota people at Wounded Knee in 1890.
The end result was around 300 Lakota Sioux, half being women and children, murdered by soldiers of the United States Army,
and contributed to the slaughter of thousands of indigenous people during the westward expansion throughout the late 1800s. Sarah Winchester spent much of her time trying to ignore the bloodshed from her home in Connecticut. In 1866, she gave birth to her first and only child, Annie. However, Annie was sickly and weak, and she died of malnourishment at only 6 weeks old. The loss was difficult for Sarah, but she did her best to continue living life with her husband. Around 1870, William was diagnosed with tuberculosis. He died on March 7, 1881, only 1 year after the death of his father. Sarah Winchester suddenly found herself an extremely wealthy woman. She decided to move into a beautiful 8-bedroom farmhouse in the Santa Clara Valley in Northern California. In hopes that her family would move in with her, she began building additions onto the home. Sarah was the daughter of a carpenter, and her love of woodworking and architecture drove her to continue designing and renovating her new home. I'm sure you've heard that this is where things get a little paranormal. The story that's often told is that Sarah was informed by a psychic that she was under a spiritual attack, which led to the deaths of her husband and infant daughter, and the heiress of the Winchester fortune was cursed by the bloodshed that resulted from the very thing that made her so rich. As a result, she decided to build confusing labyrinthian hallways and staircases to nowhere in her home as a way to confuse the angry souls of those who died by the Winchester rifle. People alleged that she would commune with the spirits every night and draw up blueprints to appease and confuse the angry spirits. But in reality, there isn't any evidence that she was communing with the dead through psychics and seances. Her remorse showed more through the way she anonymously donated to several different charities. Sarah paid her employees well as they completed her various amateur architecture projects. She would build things just to tear them down. The constant construction actually contributed a lot to the local economy, and wanting to keep people employed played a huge role in her wanting to continue expanding the labyrinthian house. An earthquake in 1906 caused major damage to her home. At this point, Sarah was kind of over the whole thing. She instructed her workers to do whatever they had to do to make it safe, but she wasn't keen on doing more additions to the home. Because of this, there are several staircases that were blocked off, doors that lead to nowhere, and the house became even stranger than it already was. There's a lot of misinformation about Sarah Winchester. In reality, she was just a woman who grew up very poor and managed to inherit a lot of money. It seems that she continued building and designing simply because she thought it was fun. She was able to be an independent woman at a time when women were typically far from it. She could afford to do exactly what she wanted to do, which was build a beautiful, strange house and donate her money to people who needed it. She kept many people employed by continuing to build onto the house for 38 years, and by the time the construction ended, there were 160 rooms. Sarah Winchester died on September 5th, 1922. The majority of her wealth went to charities and a hospital back home in Connecticut. She even willed a portion of her estate to her employees, who worked so hard making the visions of her mansion a reality. The remaining $3,000 went to her beloved niece, Daisy, who also inherited the contents of the elaborate house. But the house itself was auctioned, and John H. Brown purchased it. John Brown was a theme park worker and designed some of the first roller coasters ever built. He also allegedly helped to develop the story about how Sarah Winchester was constantly building to flee the angry spirits, turning the house into a tourist attraction, and he even had plans of making it into an amusement park at one point. Whether or not the Winchester Mystery House is haunted, I can't say, but Sarah Winchester was far from a wacky spiritualist. She was a generous person with a weird hobby, and I think she should be remembered for the good that she did. By building her maze of a mansion, she was able to give back to her community, and her legacy remains a fascinating and confusing part of American history. Sarah was known by those who were closest to her as smart and business savvy, and now you know that side of her as well. Now you know the untold truth of Sarah Winchester.